Well, hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. I'm Richard and this is Lap of the World. Soon again to be your home for road trips and racetracks, but for today we are finishing up the last episode in our NSX NA1 NSX Major Service series. This being part 10, kind of official part 10, in about a 10 to 12 part series that we've done in reality here, where we have been dealing with some timing belt, water pump, and coolant hose change at 289,000 miles on my 1992 NSX back here. We are finishing up today in this last episode with one of the more obnoxious tasks that there is to do on an NSX at any given point in its life, and that is fill and bleed the coolant system. Periodically you should just be changing the coolant as a matter of course, but of course I had all the coolant hoses off the car, so it's dry right now. There is no coolant in the system whatsoever. So we have to fill it from scratch. In a traditional front engine car, that's kind of a tricky operation, but you really only have two high points, usually the top of the radiator and maybe an expansion tank to deal with. In the NSX being mid-engined and having its radiator in the front and the motor in the back, you have high points at the top of the radiator, the top of the heater loop, the expansion tank itself, where the water pipes that go under the car have to go up over the gas tank. And then there's also kind of a high point at the thermostat. So those are all places where you could end up with a bubble that could vapor lock the system and cause your car to overheat if you do not perform the rituals appropriately. And I jokingly say rituals, but you'll see what I mean. Is there is definitely a specific sequence that you have to follow when you're doing this by the book in order to have good results. Now I am doing this by the book today. There is an easy button, and I will cover that at the end. It might be worth you spending $100 if you already have a decent sized air compressor. It might be worth spending the extra couple hundred bucks to get what's called a Venturi vacuum bleeder. That will definitely hasten the process, if not free you from having to do this kind of bleeding entirely. But today, since I have a feeling that the majority of people that are going to DIY this the first time probably will not have such a thing, I'm going to do it the hard way by going through and slowly filling and manually bleeding in the sequence specified by the shop manual the coolant system. So, with that said, let's jump straight into a little bit of setup work that will make our lives easier. Your supply list for this job will start with approximately 4 gallons of Honda Acura Type 2 coolant or your preferred equivalent. I say 4 gallons, the job actually in the book calls for 12.7 quarts, which is just a little bit over 3 gallons, but if you have to perform the bleeding operation more than once or twice to get things perfect, you're going to be glad you had the rest of that 4th gallon to work with. The next things you're going to want are some empty containers and some 5mm inside diameter tubing. And this will help you in 2 ways. One, it will help you spot bubbles as they come out more easily. And 2, it will hopefully make sure that most of your excess coolant from the bleeding process ends up in a container rather than on your garage floor. But I will say, just go ahead and anticipate there being a mess and position some drain pans accordingly, because not all of the bleeder screws seal perfectly around the bottom, so you're going to have a little bit of kind of overflow in that manner, and then it always just ends up making a mess somehow. It just is what it is. So be prepared for that. Otherwise, it's just kind of your basic tools to get to the bleeding apparatus. Let me show you where those all are. Starting in the front compartment, we have the radiator bleed tock up here. Then we have the coolant loop bleed valve, or if you have the original part here, you might just have a rubber cap with a hose clamp on it. It's way easier if you change to the updated part number, because you can do what I have done here and apply some of my 5mm hose into a loop that runs into a container, so that as I'm bleeding this, I don't end up just pouring coolant on top of the battery. Now, speaking of which, while I have taken precautions, I do kind of anticipate there being a little bit of a mess, so I've gone ahead and covered the battery up with some plastic just to protect it all the same. Moving to the back here, we have some sexy valve covers, and behind those we have what they're calling the water pipe bleed point. There is another valve there. That is where those large water pipes, coolant pipes, go over the top of the gas tank. That is another area. We're going to put some tubing on that and find a place to set up another bottle here in a moment. But first we need to find our last bleed point, which is a little bit hidden. And for some perspective, you're looking at the throttle body here, and there's kind of a dash pot off to the left of that if you're looking at it from the USDM driver's side of the car, left side of the car. And if you look due south of that, under the throttle body, you will find the last bleed point in the car. Apart, obviously, from the expansion tank itself, which is right up here. So I'm going to pause there now that we know where everything is. I'm going to get all my tubing hooked up, and then we will start our bleeding process. So with everything in position, let's quickly talk through our final setup before we start pouring coolant back in the car. One thing of note, I have elected to leave off the center tunnel cover for the time being. There are a couple of drain plugs on the coolant pipes down there that do have a propensity to leak if you don't have them tightened well enough, or if you have forgotten to replace the crush washers. You want to know that sooner rather than later to avoid wasting a lot of coolant. Second, to accomplish getting a tube to connect to our radiator bleed valve here with our Koyo rad, I've used one of these. You can find these little nylon adapters that will thread into the top of the radiator and then give you a nipple onto which you can push your 5mm tubing to hopefully avoid a large mess. I mean, there's still probably going to be a small mess, but this should keep things to a minimum. Moving to the engine compartment, I have everything set up on the left-hand side of the car, since that's where I have the best access to everything. I can kind of barely reach, if I'm on my stool, I can reach the drain plug back over there, the bleed plug over on the water pipe back there. But there's no way I could get to the thermostat bleed plug or very easily the expansion tank from the other side of the car. So I have everything positioned over here so I can keep an eye on it. And then I do have a spill-free funnel. So it's basically, it's nothing really special. It's just a funnel that you can kind of jam a stick in to plug the outlet, so then you can pick the funnel off without evacuating its contents everywhere else if it happens to not drain all the way into the system. That will be important as we get to kind of the last stages of bleeding it. It also does accomplish moving your the ultimate height of your coolant level a little bit higher, which will help to work out some bubbles again as we get towards the end of the process. But this is the setup, so let's get started. Before we start actually adding coolant, let's talk about the bleeding sequence. The order in which you should see things start to happen, as well as the order in which you should close the bleeders once you have stopped getting air bubbles out, is as follows. First would be the thermostat or water inlet cover. Second would be the radiator. Third is the heater loop. And fourth is the engine water pipe. That's near the bulkhead. As we actually start adding coolant, it's worth noting that you want to go kind of slow here. Not at a drip, but if you just chug a bunch of coolant in the system, that's actually going to promote the creation of air bubbles and make your life a lot harder. Whereas if you add it at kind of a smooth, consistent pace, it should be able to fill evenly without a whole lot of turbulence and hopefully make the bleeding process go a little more smoothly. With the first gallon more or less smoothly added to the car, now is when you want to really go around and check for leaks. Look underneath the radiator, look underneath the tunnel, look over where on the water pump side of the motor, anywhere that you suspect a leak could come from. Give it a few minutes to kind of settle and make sure that you could spot any drips, because you definitely want to catch it now in the first gallon rather than as you're finishing up the third gallon. Don't expect to see anything out of the bleed ports until you are well into your third gallon, but as you start pouring that third gallon, now is the time to start kind of paying attention to make sure that you have all of your catch containers positioned appropriately and so on, as you should now be looking for some fluid to start rising up in a couple of them. So as we start to get fluid out of all four of our bleed points, just a couple of quick notes. One divot I will point out that I fixed, but you can avoid my mistake here, is I repositioned my catch container for my radiator. I originally had it sort of cradled in the bumper because that was convenient, but that actually puts the bottom of the container lower than my fill point in the back, So it was starting to just fill up the container as I was filling that back there. I caught it before it overflowed, but I did have to relocate it somewhere higher and kind of pick it up a little bit to where I could reverse that flow a little bit and have a steady kind of column from which to bleed air bubbles. The other thing is on these fittings, this one in particular in my case, you get a little bit of welling around the bottom. You can pack a paper towel around there. I guess you could remove it and put it back in with some Teflon tape ahead of time. But just understand that's going to happen. It's probably also happening on the thermostat in the rear, but it's not much of a drip, but just understand it's going to happen. So if you find some later, make sure you've accounted for that as a possibility versus a leak. But the other thing you will want to do is kind of walk around and squeeze the larger radiator hoses. That will help to kind of work some of the bubbles out. The only other thing at this point that's going to help work bubbles out is just going to be time or a vacuum bleeder again, as you go that far. But at this point we have, given we have a smooth flow out of all of our bleed points, showing you again here in the rear, this is for the thermostat, that's that column, and then down there you have the water pipe. Again, our spill-free funnel currently empty, so we've not overflowed that at all. So we're going to add a little bit more coolant, and then we're going to start tightening our bleed points. So having now gotten as many air bubbles out of the system as I can by exercising the hoses, kind of squeezing all of the large water hoses until I'm getting largely bubble-free ebbs and flows of coolant. And you can also tell, maybe not from this camera angle, but if I look over here, you can tell that the top of this water level is pretty close to this one. So I think at least in the front, I'm probably getting close to bubble free, which means it's time to start closing things. Now I've already shut the valve for the, which is in the correct order. I have first shut the thermostat valve in the back, and now I need to do the radiator. And there is no graceful way of doing this. You will make a mess. The best you can do is move as quickly as possible. And I will allow you a little bit of mirth as I attempt this myself. Now, you're going to undo this guy. Well, I've done better and I've done worse. Now that I've gone around and closed the rest of the bleed plugs in sequence, so again, starting with the thermostat, then the radiator, then the heater loop, then the water pipe back in the engine bay. All those now being closed and having a seemingly appropriate amount of coolant in the system, we are kind of done with what I'm going to call the cold bleeding process. Again, don't be afraid to go around. You may end up spending, half an hour to an hour going around squishing different big hoses until you stop seeing notable amount of bubbles coming out of the of your various tubes. But once you get that far, as far as you can get, then you're kind of done with the cold bleed process and it's time to move on. The next thing we're going to be doing, actually the next thing I'm going to be doing is cleaning up my messes. Because anywhere that I dribbled or ended up with a puddle of coolant from popping a hose off or popping a tube off when I wasn't expecting it, or fumbling with a plug too long and having some spill out. I want to clean all that up because I need to be able to tell the difference between a new mess and an old mess. The other thing I'm going to do right now, given the time of day, is I'm going to leave. And I'm going to let the car sit overnight because honestly, and this isn't a terrible idea if you're not in a hurry, is if you leave the radiator or leave the pressure cap off of the expansion tank and just let it sit for a while. Gravity is your friend. Gravity and time are your friends in this. And then I'm going to come back tomorrow and we'll start with the kind of final hot bleed where we're going to fire the car for the first time in a couple of months and let the coolant actually start circulating under pressure and see where we get with that. See if we've had if we've done well enough with our cold bleed. That should be a pretty short and simple process. If we haven't done that well with our cold bleed, then we may have to go around and repeat that sequence again once we've kind of pressure and heat cycled the car once. But we will see once we get that far. See you in like 2 seconds your time tomorrow in my time. It is now a new day, but fortunately we have no new messes underneath the car, so that means we can proceed to our next step, which is going to be to actually fire the car for the first time in a few months and let the coolant system actually warm all the way up and hopefully self-bleed any bubbles that are left out through the expansion tank, after which we'll kind of try and gauge our coolant level and get that kind of set where it's going to be. And now, since the car hasn't fired in a couple of months at this point, the first thing I'm going to do is pull the fuel pump fuse, which is I think the number 2 fuse in the footwell up here, and let it crank just a couple of times to give oil a chance to circulate before any explosions are involved. And then we will plug the fuse back in and proceed with our test after I open the garage door back there so I don't gas myself. Having pre-fired the car, we can move on to the sort of what I'll call the hot bleed process, which involves putting the radiator cap, or the expansion tank cap in our case with an NSX, back on at kind of half-cocked position. So when you put this on, you have this initial spin that you go through, and then it kind of gets to a first stop. And you can still wiggle it, but you can't lift it. That's where you want to leave it for this step. Normally, you would twist it a little bit further, and then you can no longer really wiggle it easily or lift it. That is fully closed and pressurized. We're going to back it off to right here, where it's still kind of loose. Now, this is applicable for any radiator or expansion tank cap. Obviously, I have an aftermarket expansion tank, but it works the same way with the stock expansion tank, just the cap looks a little bit different. All right, well, not sure if you can hear me, but after a few extra cranks, but no pops, booms, clacks, or cracks, she fired right up. So now we wait. We just need to wait until the coolant comes up to actual temperature, and I'm gonna get back in here and start watching the gauge in earnest though, to make sure it doesn't go beyond where it should, which would indicate that we would still have some bubbles. Again, if all goes well, we could be good to go after this cycle. Otherwise, I may have to go back and re-burp it with the cold bleed technique once it's cooled back off. But we'll see. Update coming in moments. All right, so we've been idling probably about 10 minutes at this point. I'd say 5 or 10 minutes, and we have coolant. The temperature is kind of settled in, and just below halfway there. Oil pressure has continued to be good. Just by feel, I can tell that we are getting hot water flow through, or hot coolant flow through the radiator. So at this point, we're waiting on it to kind of settle in and soak until the point where the fan actually comes on. And then once that happens, our test is done. All right, it has begun to come on intermittently, so we're going to shut her down and check our coolant level. With the car turned back off, it is now time to check our coolant level. So again, you want to be careful, use gloves, because if you are overfilled and it happens to sploot out at you, it could burn. And I'll use my, I don't have a, the factory coolant tank, you'll be able to just kind of shine a flashlight in the top of it because it looks like a milk jug and it's a little translucent. So you can stick a flashlight in the top of it and just visually see the level. For this one, we're going to use our Mark 1 Mod 0 dipstick. We're probably, if we're honest, we're probably a little bit over full on that, but that's okay. I can, that will either self-correct the first time I take it on a real drive, and I'll just have to empty my, my Powerade bottle, or what I'll probably end up doing is siphoning some of it out. I say siphoning some of it out with, sucking some of it out with my trusty turkey baster. Just to make sure we don't make a mess. So I'm probably a little bit over full, but that's okay. Everything else is checked out, and I think we are good to go. Now, so what we've done up to this point has been what I called hard mode with respect to bleeding the coolant system. It's a multi-stage process. You gotta, go through a bunch of rigmarole, spend an hour or so squishing hoses to get all the bubbles out, probably make a big mess, etc., etc. And I said at the beginning of the video I would show you the easy button, and here you go. So for the easy button, you need one of these, which is a vacuum Venturi bleeder, and I will leave a link in the description below, assuming it's still available, to the one that I have, because it does work pretty well. So what you do with this is you hook it up, it plugs the top of the expansion tank or your radiator cap, whichever the case may be. You have this valve open and you connect your air compressor over here, and then you put this into this tube in a bucket. Then you turn your air on, you open this valve, and it draws a vacuum on the cooling system. Now, obviously this is going to work best when it's empty, but it will work while it's full, and this is why you have this, this end of the tube in a bucket, so it'll catch whatever it is you're sucking out. So it draws a vacuum, and once you have full vacuum on here, you close this valve, then you pop this extension off, and now you have a vacuum on there, and then you put this, stick this attachment on here, which has a strainer tube attached to it and nothing else. Then when you crack this back open, the vacuum you've drawn, you'll have this end here down in your 5-gallon bucket that you've put in whatever, in the NSX's case, the 3.5 gallons of coolant. You just put it in a big bucket, stick this in the bottom of it, crack this open, and it will just suck everything into the system. And assuming you drain most of the bucket, you should be good to go at that point with maybe a little bit of topping off. Total time investment probably, half to a third of what you would do with a normal thing. Worst case scenario, you do this to fill it. It gets 90% of everything done, and then you could go around and just quickly burp all the bleeder valves. That's the easy button. Again, I'll leave a link in the description below if you want to pick one of these guys up. And so with that first firing under our belt and the coolant system now in theory fully bled, we should be able to get back to normal service. This puts a bow on and draws to a close our NSX NA1 NSX Major Service Series by Lap of the World, sponsored in part by ATR, NSX-parts.com. One last plug for old time's sake, link in the description. I do appreciate the support from all of those guys. And I appreciate all of your support in watching. If you have enjoyed this series, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future NSX mechanical shenanigans. And sorry, somebody said they had a drinking game for every time I said shenanigans. I don't know how often I say it, but have another shot on me. Anyhow, that's where we're going to leave it today. I appreciate everybody again for watching. Your support means a whole lot. And with all of that said, I'm Richard, this is Lap of the World, and I will see you guys all in the next video, if not out at the track.